Okay. All right. Good morning, everybody. Um, I'm going to lead the meeting today since our chair, Bill Steele, is teaching in New Mexico State University's twice a year important regulatory course, and one of our newest analysts is actually there taking the course with a lot of other folks. So um, welcome. Um, Hector, do we have a quorum to adopt minutes from last time?
No quorum yet. We're
Okay,
short one person.
okay, well, they're probably going to join. I'll be optimistic. But we'll go ahead without those first couple of quick agenda items. And I'll take a moment to introduce our two new members to the board and then our terrific speaker. So, Michael Carter is here with us, and he's a brand new member from Congressional District 2. He's out of Boulder, and he's got a career in working to transform the utility industry from a business point of view, business strategy towards sustainability and innovation, power generation, utility retail operations, and then that's electric side, and then the gas side too, including customer experience and a lot of work on um, renewable energy systems being integrated. He has a degree from the School of Mines, which is great, in something called economic geology, which I think is great and I never heard of, but terrific. And he also has an undergrad degree in the same economic geology from the Australian University, National University. So he's joining us today. Welcome, Michael. And
Hello,
then,
everyone.
hello, there he goes. Thanks. Good to see your face. And then also joining us, a brand new member, is Jessica Lau. And Jessica is from Golden, and she represents Congressional District 7. And she is a grid strategy consultant, has her own startup business called Artful Pathways. But her diverse background is in, working for a national renewable energy laboratory, for Excel and other grid operators. So her career has spanned everything from transmission and generation to wholesale markets and new technologies. And we welcome you, Jessica, to your first meeting.
Great. Thank you so much.
Good, great. And so now I get to introduce someone else. This is the best part is being happy to introduce people given all the great backgrounds we have. So John Gavin is a former PUC commissioner who joins us from Paonia, which if you've never been there, I've been there and I've been to Hotchkiss, and it's a wonderful place and beautiful, partly because it's remote. But anyway, you are not. Obviously, you're totally tied in to the issues. He was a commissioner from 2018 to 2023, and he has a great deal of experience in some of the local entities, such as the Delta Montrose Electric Association, being on the board, which is a co-op, electric co-op, and also all kinds of Delta County and economic development on tri-state boards, and so tri-state transmission generation. Um, it's generation and transmission. Hey, but they do both either way. And John comes from a great career in the Navy, which we thank you for your service. And he's always been a technology person. And now you don't work on the guided missiles anymore, which makes my hand shake thinking about it. But instead, you work on major energy issues in the state of Colorado and also telecom, as far as the deployment of broadband in rural areas. He also has 6 patents in the information technology and telecommunications space. So that's really excellent. And now that he is on the other side, so to speak, he's not a serving commissioner. He's able to come talk to us, and he's spoken to us before about resources for electricity. And now I asked him to come talk to us about data centers. Everybody's heard about, oh, data centers are coming and they're going to use your electricity and your lights are going to go out at home or whatever. And then the article has a photograph of a huge building, which could be any building, really. Like, what is in there is a question. What exactly is in there? So I asked John to come speak to us. And John, I'm just going to let you take it away.
Oh, well, thank you, Cindy, for having me. It's always a pleasure to meet with this group and really appreciate the opportunity to chat. And I'd like to kind of go fairly quickly through this brief presentation and then have a Q&A session because I know people have a lot of questions. And I hope you also got a very large file that included 98 slides that Maury Wolfson, a former PUC staffer and NREL analyst, put together on this topic, which dives into really as much detail as you'll ever want to see. So I encourage you to take a look at that as well, after this.
We put that, John, just so they know, you didn't get an email with that. We put that in the drive, the board
Oh,
member.
okay, good.
Sure.
And I put in a drive as well, and the link is on the last page.
Oh, terrific.
Great. Well, anyway, first of all, what's a data center? Well, a data center is really essentially a warehouse for computers, lots of them. And, I've been in the worked in the IT business for 30 years. And, back in the early days, data centers were fairly small. We'd have one or two IBM mainframes in them with a whole bunch of disk drives, and that was it. And then mid-range computing burst on the scene and made the mainframe basically obsolete. So all of a sudden we started deploying, hundreds of servers in racks. And, a standard EIA rack is, 19 inches wide, about 77 inches high, and it holds about 10 servers roughly. And so for, 25 years, that was the deployment model for all IT services, just, host your application on a server in a rack in some remote data center, and it served the business need very well. And so then as time progressed, we came into, the last 10 years where the size of data centers has just expanded dramatically. It's not unusual now to see, a 1 million square foot data center going in. And couple that with the power consumption of the servers these days has just skyrocketed. In my day, a server rack would burn about 4 kilowatts. Today, a server rack burns 120 kilowatts. So when you aggregate that across, like 1,000 racks, suddenly you have some pretty big numbers as far as power consumption goes. And more interestingly, in the last few years, the data center industry has moved toward a campus approach where, they'll buy a big piece of property, 60 to 100 acres, and put multiple buildings on that property and expand as they need it. So more and more we're seeing not these small, inner city data centers, but these massive campuses being built, around the country. And if you really want to see how crazy this can get, I call people's attention to Northern Virginia, which is known as Data Center Alley. And if you just Google Northern Virginia data center, you'll just get a huge amount of information of just about how this has impacted that whole area. Dominion Energy, their power provider, is just scrambling, building transmission and new generation in order to try to keep up. And it's had a negative impact on, Dominion's ratepayers, which is, my biggest concern and why we're here today primarily.
John?
Yeah.
I just raised my hand because I quickly Googled how many square feet is the Pentagon, because that's the biggest building. That's 6.5 million square feet.
Yeah.
You're talking about a single data center of 1 million square feet.
Oh, yeah.
This is scary numbers. Yeah.
Exactly. In fact, Elon Musk is building one in Texas that I understand is going to be I think it's going to be like 2 million square feet, and it's going to burn like 2.5 gigawatts of power. So it's just
Yeah.
mind-blowing.
All right, I interrupted you. Let you finish.
Yeah.
Okay.
And again, I talked to the power consumption. The smallest data centers burn about 25 or 30, megawatts, all the way up to, like I said, this huge data center that's being built. It's going to need its own power supply, basically. And the other factor for us in Colorado is water consumption. Data centers use a lot of water for cooling. And, there are two ways to cool data centers: evaporative cooling, which is what utilities or what data center developers like to use, especially in dry climates like Colorado, because it's more efficient, from a power use standpoint. But it's an evaporative process, so it's a consumptive use of water. So that water just disappears into the atmosphere. The other option is vapor compression cooling, basically refrigeration cycle. And, that's more efficient from a water use standpoint, but it adds a lot of additional electric load. And in a vapor compression cooled data center, about 40% of the power consumption is now, the refrigeration process. So a lot of different factors in play and, that make this very concerning. And the other thing you always hear about is, when big tech comes into town and starts pitching data centers, they talk about lots of jobs. And sure, there are a lot of jobs in the construction phase. You've got all the trades involved building these things. But once they get completed and go into production and the servers are installed and wired up, there's only a handful of people, and they're mostly security guards. I used to take people back in my old MCI telecommunications days, take some of our big clients for data center tours at our North Royalton, Ohio data center. And it was kind of funny. You'd go take them into this room. They go through a security checkpoint. You have to leave your mobile devices and your phones behind and all that. And then you go into the data center, and the first question is, wow, it's really cold in here. Then the next question is, boy, it's noisy too. And then finally, the one that always struck me is they say, where are all the people? Because literally, you have thousands of square feet of space with no humans. So just to put that in perspective, the job uplift is really just a temporary thing during construction. And then in Colorado, just this session, we had two pieces of legislation that were kind of oriented toward the data center industry. HB 1177, which kind of enriched our existing economic development rate tariff. And I'll talk more about the EDR tariff a little bit later, but that bill passed. There was another bill, SB 280, which was intended to provide big tax incentives to data center developers, which didn't make it. And I'm thankful that it didn't, because, data centers are coming. That's the message I have for people. You don't need to incent them. This is the wealthiest industry segment, with a $12 trillion capitalization, so they can afford to pay their way. And that's my standpoint. Moving on to the next.
Ron, one second. Ron Lair put a question in the chat, but Ron, why don't you just go ahead and tell us what your question is?
Hi, John.
Hi, Ron.
Hey, good to see you. Been my thesis that data centers are not all of one kind, so we need to segment and think thoughtfully about each kind.
Yeah.
And you referenced 40% cooling load as kind of a rule of thumb. I wondered if you had more data about different cooling loads for different kinds of data centers. And then it seemed to me that since thermal loads are more adaptable to load management, that if we thought about the cooling loads, we could get some load flexibility out of these data centers, even if they're running their electronics full on all the time.
Yeah, sure. You have time of day issues. It's cooler at night, so your cooling load goes down at night. Again, talking first to the types of data centers, yes, there's probably 4 or 5 different types. Enterprise data centers, what are now called colo data centers, where they implement their own generation to go with the data center. AI data centers, which are kind of the rage, and a few other types. I'm primarily focused on the large cloud computing and AI data centers and colos. And so, the other thing about load flexibility, when you're spending $40,000 per processor in a server rack, where you can have hundreds of processors, the cost of the equipment to run it, the server equipment to run in a data center is mind-boggling. It's not unusual to see $1 billion of computers in one. And so in order to recover their investment, the operators have to run those servers 7x24, 365. So you hear a lot of talk about, well, we can load shift and, maybe do some kind of demand side management with data centers. But the fact is, these things run flat out, and they have to in order to break even. So there's not as much of a load shifting opportunity as people think. And the other thing you mentioned, Ron, we're seeing a trend back to water cooling now. So most of the newest NVIDIA processors are now water cooled. So that makes them a little more efficient. And this kind of makes me laugh because back in the old days, the mainframes were all water cooled. And then in the 90s, we shifted to air cooling. And now we're going back to water.
Let me come back to you. The good thing about a thermal load is you can store cool. You could have a big tank of water and cool it at night and then use it all day. And you could run the chips all the time, but you'd run your cooler more when it's appropriate and less when it's not. And that seemed to me to be a missing piece of this. Is anybody working at that? Is that
Well, you have to look at the BTU output of these processors. It's massive.
Yeah.
I don't think there's going to be a cool storage option that would really make much of a dent. These things are turning out enormous amounts of heat. So it's just scale. It's just like when people talk about, well, we can power them all with renewables. To power a 1 gigawatt, data center with solar would take about 24 square miles of solar panels. And then what do you do after the sun goes down? Then you have to fire up your combustion turbines. And if you want to build a combustion turbine array to power a data center, look at about $1.5 to $2 million per megawatt. So you could be looking at $1 billion or more of combustion turbines if you want to go that route. So just the costs and the scale of this stuff is just something we haven't thought about before. So I hope that just kind of answers it a little bit. Let me move on to the next slide then. What do data centers require? We've touched on this, an unprecedented amount of power in many cases.
Well, John, I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second. I don't know if folks can see your slides.
I'm sorry.
I didn't.
I'm sorry. I didn't even think to bring them up.
Don't worry. We're okay. We're all friends here.
Maybe if Hector could bring them up.
Hector, he could take it, and then you just tell us where we are in this.
Yeah. I'm on. I think slide 3. Yeah. Next slide. Next one. Oh, wait. Oh, sorry. Go back. Yeah, here we are. Okay. So what do data center developers look for? They're scouring the country, and the first criteria is power, obviously. They're looking for low-cost electric power, hopefully subsidies of some sort, which some states have. And just power is just, the number one factor. Number 2, of course, is fiber optic network connectivity, and that, these data centers, need terabits of fiber connectivity to support the data transfer. Obviously, water for cooling and land. I've talked about how the land requirements seem to be going up as the campus model is adopted more and more. So you can see in Colorado, a few of these are kind of a problem. Water, is number 1 in my opinion, and power is another one. I'll talk more about that in a minute, but it's going to be probably the pacing factor for us. And move on to the next slide then. Okay, and so, it's kind of interesting to look at what's driving data center deployments and why are we suddenly, just in the last 2 years, hearing about this as a major issue. Well, obviously, we're all tied to our mobile devices, and we all use cloud, internet services and social media and all these other services that are hosted in a cloud environment in a data center. The demand for these cloud services just keeps growing exponentially, and it was driving the deployment of some data centers. But then the real big kicker that hit us was AI, artificial intelligence. When NVIDIA, the major producer of AI specific processors, introduced their I think it was called the Hopper chip about 3 years ago, kind of revolutionized the opportunity for AI. And, ChatGPT and all these other AI developers took off and capitalized on the power of this hardware. And suddenly we saw AI applications burst into the consumer realm. AI has been around for a long time. In fact, one of my patents is for an AI-based fraud control system for telecom fraud. And that was back in 1995. But, it's a whole different world now. And AI, I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a few minutes, but it's something we need to watch very, very carefully. Next slide. And obviously, you've read all the articles in the media about, how electric load growth is now taking off again. And this has become like the #1 issue for utilities and regulators across the country. Everybody's worried about resource adequacy, especially as we proceed through the energy transition. And, as in the state of Colorado, as we retire, our coal assets and gas assets and move to renewables. It's a real challenge because for 25 years, we had 2 to 3% load growth, which is easy for a grid planner to manage. And now it's suddenly taking that hockey stick again and going up. And at the same time, all the utilities will tell you we're facing massive supply chain, financing, and cost issues in procuring new resources. So, I just saw some data, like if you want to buy a combustion turbine, for a combined cycle plant, you're looking at a 7-year wait. So that's, in transformers, 2 to 3 years. Luckily, we have a pretty good stock of solar panels. Our developers in the U.S. stockpiled about 62 gigawatts of solar panels, so they're sitting in warehouses ready to go into production. So that's the one good news story in the supply chain. So the drivers of load growth, again, data centers far and away the #1. EV adoption also. Colorado has surpassed California in EV adoption rates. I think I saw we were close to 30% of new car sales in first quarter, something close to that. So we've got like 106,000 EVs on the road. And if you look at the BTU equivalent of a gallon of gasoline and transfer that to a kilowatt hour of electricity, it means a lot of new load just from our adoption of EVs so far. So, I'd say data centers and EV adoption are the two biggest drivers. But of course, we have, all the other end-use electrical processes like heating and deploying heat pumps and other electrification technologies that are going to drive more load growth. Any questions on this before I move on? All right, next slide. So how do we get here? I think a lot of people kind of got blindsided. There was a lot of technology developments going on that didn't get a lot of attention. We all knew about the internet and cloud computing and all that, but then NVIDIA blew the doors off of processors with their new chipsets, and network technology just kept advancing as well as build outs. I like to tell people I have to drive 30 miles to my first traffic light. Yet if I wanted it, I could get 6 gigabit broadband service at my house for like $260. And 6 gigabit broadband service is probably more than most office towers in Denver had 5 years ago. So it's mind-boggling, that kind of bandwidth. I could download a movie in less than a second. And this is, being deployed across the whole country. So, it makes our remote, broadband-free backwaters are disappearing pretty quickly. And the other issue is software has really advanced dramatically. And you never hear about this, but the whole concept of virtualization revolutionized computing. And virtualization is where you have software that is able to take large clusters of hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of computers and make them look like one virtual computer. before virtualization, you had to have individual servers sharing work, doing the workload, so you could never scale. But with virtualization now, we've built this national computing fabric, as the technologists call it, that allow us to build services that we never could before. And now virtualization is going across geographic areas as well. So you have clusters of data centers that link together to provide a big computing fabric that's even more capable. And of course, we all know about AI and just what's happened in the last 3 years. But I will point out, you've read recently, back in January about DeepSeek, a Chinese company that developed a way to train their algorithms using just a fraction of the power that our US companies have needed. And so there's all kinds of innovation that's still going on and will continue to go on, in the AI space. So we're just in the earliest days of where AI will go. And this kind of also exposes, there's a lot of unknowns out there too. Could this be a bubble? Entirely possible. After DeepSeek's news hit the street, a lot of people said, oh, the AI bubble's over, let's move on, no more data centers. But, now we're back in the original path again. So, I'm starting to think that, the probability of it being a bubble is decreasing. Then move on to the next slide. So where are the likely locations in Colorado for data centers? Well, data center developers like to be in close to an urban area. So the Front Range corridor obviously is number one. And we currently have a couple big data center projects going on in the Denver metro area. The largest being the QTS project, which is 4 buildings on a 64-acre site. Only the first building's been built so far. And that one building, that one data center is generating 177 megawatt load. So it's going to become Xcel Energy's largest load, surpassing the Climax molybdenum mine, believe it or not. But there's also activity going on in Colorado Springs. Pueblo is anxiously courting data centers as a new business opportunity for the community. We'll see what happens there, because my biggest concern with Pueblo is, they don't have excess power. Black Hills Energy is, doesn't have a lot of headroom. So if you wanted to put a big data center in Pueblo, it'd probably have to be a colo, where the data center developer would also build out the gas turbine generation to support the data center. And then that raises all of the other issues about emissions and the energy transition and all of the problems that would entail. And then if you look at the map, these are our transmission lines. We have, some other locations, potentially on the western slope where we could see data center development, although we don't have a lot of excess power out here either. But I do like to point out one interesting thing. About 3 years ago now, a data center developer bought the old Louisiana Pacific fiber or chipboard plant in Olathe, Colorado, right a little bit south of me. And they built out a 10 megawatt solar array, and we're going to host a crypto mining facility there. Well, and they were interconnecting to DMEA. Well, the whole thing collapsed, and I don't know whatever happened, but the solar panels are still out there providing power to DMEA, but they never put the crypto mining computers in. So just an example of how these things can go south and change at will. Next slide. So final important thought I wanted to pass on. I think that we, as guardians of consumer interests, we have to watch the artificial intelligence sector really, really carefully, because I think, people will look back in 50 years and will say that AI and the deployment of AI is the single biggest transformative issue of this century. And it's going to touch every aspect of our lives. And what scares me is, it's so ripe for misuse. So we'll have to think carefully about how to control it, how to manage it, how to make sure it doesn't become, a weapon to use against consumers, because I think there's a real risk of misuse there. And as you probably followed in the papers, Colorado did pass an AI protections bill last year, and now there's a big debate as to whether it's too stringent or whether it needs modification. So there may be a special session called to work on that one issue. So again, I encourage everybody on this board to really keep an eye on that, on the AI space, so that we stay aware of what's going on. Next slide. And here, I encourage you to take a look at Maury Wolfson's presentation. It's fantastic, tons of data. So get yourself a cup of coffee and plan on spending a couple hours going through it. But it answers almost every question you have about data centers, and it's very Colorado specific too. So he has a lot of great information in there. And then the other thing is, the Harvard Environmental Policy Center published a really, really good report, about 3 or 4 months ago, that analyzed the cost shift problem that data centers can present to consumer electric rates and other consumer costs. So I encourage everybody to look at that paper. And I also call your attention to page 36 of that paper, because it refers to our QTS data center that's being built in Aurora, like I said, which secured an economic development rate, the only economic development rate I think that we've awarded since the EDR tariff went into effect in 2018. And I estimate the EDR rate, by the way, allows utilities to offer a discounted power rate to large loads as long as that power rate is above their marginal cost of electricity. So just my back of the napkin estimate shows that at 177 megawatts, QTS could be getting a $50 million a year break on their power costs. And, obviously Excel is not going to take a earnings per share hit on that discount. So who pays for that? The rest of the ratepayers. So just wanted to leave you with that thought. That's that cost shift, issue in full force here in Colorado. So with that, I'd just like to open it up for discussion.
John, it looks like Ron had another question in the about the water. Ron?
Was working at the water board in the 90s after being on the PUC, and I learned that about 51% of the treated water that comes off the Denver water system goes out to maintain bluegrass in a semi-arid desert. This is crazy, and so we need to change that. And I wondered, with the advent of all this money and effort coming into data centers, if we challenge them to make an offer for me to tear out some of my turf grass so that they could get some water supplies, how much they would bid.
Are you asking?
Yeah, well.
Oh God, water is just such a hot button issue. We still have the compact under renegotiation. Out here it is an issue that we face every day. We're probably going to have the lowest irrigation flow I've ever seen in 15 years out here this year. So water is such a serious issue that you can't talk about data centers without including water. And, I look at the QTS data center in Aurora. I understand, we haven't been able to get any confirmation on this, but Aurora Water supposedly gave them a sweetheart deal on water rates. And I'd love to know more about that. In Colorado, water is probably more important than power. That's how serious this is.
It looks like Park Barrazo has his hand up.
Oh, hi, Parks. Oh, you're on mute, Parks. There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah.
I think Leslie had her hand up for me, so I don't want to jump the queue.
Hi, Leslie.
Thank you. Thanks, Parks. I have two questions. The first one is, do you think that available contractor capacity is an issue right now and will be in the foreseeable short term for these data centers? That's the first question. And the second, do you think that climate resiliency is another factor that is considered for the location analysis and process that these data centers go through?
Oh, well, your first question, are you talking about the trades, the construction workers to build the data centers in the first place?
Correct. Correct.
Yeah, in the Front Range, so far it hasn't been a problem. But when you get outside of the Front Range, like to the Western Slope, it would be a huge problem. We just don't have enough tradespeople, out here to do a lot of this work. And so, the go-to model on the Western Slope, if you're building a big commercial building, is you import a lot of the trades from other states to get the job done. That's the way it is, I'm afraid. And as far as environmental location, the whole environmental issue surrounding data centers is really, really complex. I will tell you that the tech industry has bent over backwards to try to portray data centers as, less environmentally damaging than they are. So they will do everything to, like, say they're going to source power, green power, to augment their power supply, but you know how that shell game can work. So, it's hard to say. We have a very aggressive decarbonization program underway in Colorado, achieving 80% decarbonization of the grid by 2030. So just this year, as part of that program, we're shutting down 2 coal plants and going to take 820 megawatts of power out of our power supply while we have all these new loads cropping up. So it just makes this such a difficult, challenging problem. So as far as the environmental side, I just don't see, I think the data center industry has tried to put fresh lipstick on the pig in much of what they're saying about environmental compliance. The go-to model, as an example, in many places now is to build your own gas turbine, generation plant next to the data center, and that's not a good solution.
I think Parks had his hand up, and then
Parks. I'm sorry.
Parks.
Oh, thank you. And yeah, John, thank you so much for the presentation and also for all the work I know that you did related to Senate Bill 280. And I guess a question for you, a lot of times we hear this kind of atmosphere of panic that's been created that Colorado's missing out on data centers that are coming, and look at everywhere else in the country that's going and benefiting from their economic development. Think about the fact that they're going to go to Wyoming and create more emissions because they don't have the same clean grid that Colorado does. And why shouldn't Colorado get its own slice of the pie? And folks will point out that we only have 2% of the country's data centers, which when you look at 50 states, maybe that is the right proportion, but that comment aside, what's your response to those kind of arguments about that create this real sense of urgency, and sense that absent action either before different commissions or before the legislature, that Colorado is going to miss out on the data center boom?
Oh, okay. Well, like I said earlier, the economic benefits of data centers, to a local population, local jurisdiction, are minimal. A handful of jobs, mostly security guards, and that's it. Meanwhile, many states are giving them huge tax breaks, discounted power. Let those other states make these big mistakes. I'm pretty protective of Colorado. I'd like to preserve what we have here and not do stupid things. So that's how I answer that question. Let other states make the mistake. Oh, Jessica.
Yeah, thanks for it's a very timely discussion on this topic. I was curious about if you could speak to, I think the interconnection costs of facilities like this. What rate class do data centers fall in? And based on this large, influx, what's your opinion if the rate class is designed appropriately for this going forward?
Yeah, very good question. And that's where that Harvard study that I mentioned really dives in. So I recommend you take a look at that.
Right.
Um, whenever you drop a big load like a data center load into a jurisdiction, there's going to be costs. Give you an example, QTS, 177 megawatts. They spent $28.1 million to pay for a new 230 kilovolt double circuit transmission line and substation upgrades at the Excel substation in order to power their data center. What I found very interesting was, they announced 177 megawatts as their target load. Yet you look at the throughput of a 230 kV double circuit line, and that can handle a gigawatt. So I think we're going to see QTS grow considerably larger than the 177 megawatts. So, and that's just an example. You look at North Virginia, they're spending billions of dollars on new transmission, to support the data center build out in those jurisdictions. So there always are costs, significant costs. And look at, we have our energy transition underway as well. So we already have a plate full of projects that have to get done to allow us to decarbonize the grid. And, I really fear that with the supply chain problems, the financing challenges, the new administration in Washington, that our energy transition process is going to be challenged. So why throw another monkey wrench into the works? That's my personal feeling.
Yeah, if I could jump back in before we get to
Sure.
rates too. So I think this is a curiosity I have. So, right, a lot of data centers are purchasing like a double feed too for contingency, so not just
Oh,
a
yeah.
single. So I think to your point about they bought a whole ton of capacity right there. But oftentimes like it's their interconnection, unless they are like truly building a brand new substation with an interconnecting line to a main feed, right? They are taking an existing bank that was allocated to something else.
Exactly.
And so does the cost of, let's say, actually, let's not target any particular project, right? But does that interconnection cost make up for the fact that that previously allocated bank is no longer available to the system, which had a need study that had determined that?
Yeah.
Your
Oh, very
thoughts
good
on that? Yeah.
question. Yeah, well, like I said, earlier, all along for the last 20, 25 years, we've been looking at 2 to 3% load growth. So, you know, this wasn't really an issue. We would build out an occasional new feeder, upgrade some transformers in a substation, stuff like that. It wasn't massive, you know, re-engineering of the grid the way we're now seeing that may be necessary. So just enormous challenges at the worst possible time, in my opinion. Look at what happened. Look at just the news that came out last week about Excel. They've got what, 17 feeders in Metro Denver that are just in need of complete overhaul because they're failing, and we've had all these outages because of outdated distribution. So it just shows you, we need to spend a lot of money on the grid and on distribution just to keep our heads above water. We've underinvested in the grid for the last 30 years.
Right. Yeah, and data centers are connecting at distribution level too.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, but to follow up, John, any thoughts on like what rate classes data centers are in, and
Oh.
your thoughts on appropriateness for or any adjustments needed in the future?
Oh yeah, the cost shift issue is a major concern of mine. I think we need legislation that will codify protections for the cost shift challenges. Yet we've been going the other way. We want to give away, subsidies to data centers. So I favor just the opposite. Let's make sure they pay their full way. Like I said, it's the most wealthy industry group in history, $12 trillion of capitalization. So they can afford it. So let's make them pay.
Appreciate it. Thanks, John.
John, I'm going to call on Sandra Young, a member from CD1.
Hello, John. You've answered most of my questions, but I did have a question when you said tax incentives. What kind of tax incentives is Colorado offering these data centers?
Oh, well, SB 280 did not pass. So the tax incentive attributes of that bill didn't happen. So we're good. What we are still offering those the economic development rate, discounted electric rate from the utility. And luckily, Xcel Energy has said that they will not offer EDR rates to data centers going forward. Black Hills Energy in Pueblos is anxious to do so, but again, they don't have capacity, so I don't know how they'll do it.
How long will they have those discounted rates?
Oh, well, SB or HB 1177 sweetened the economic development rate tariff, and I think it goes out 20 years now and it can be renewed. So if I'm not mistaken, it's really in perpetuity now, perpetuity.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It looks like Ron, you have your hand up.
Yeah, John, whenever I see you, I think of Bill McGowan. So if we posit a slippery hypothetical that says, as McGowan was to AT&T, are the data centers to the utility industry? Are we going to see breakdown, changes so that our dreams about DERs and microgrids and community choice and all those things start to emerge from under the heavy hand of the utility monopoly?
Oh, that's a really good question, Ron. One thing that's interesting to watch is watch Microsoft. You know, Microsoft they've announced they want to spend I think it's $80 billion in the next few years on data center buildouts. And just interestingly, you know, Bill Gates's pet project is the Kemmerer small modular reactor up in Wyoming. And so that he will go out and actively say that he views small modular reactors as the solution to the data center power supply problem. That, you know, build a hyperscale data center and put an SMR next to it. So that's an example of, I think, what you're talking about. And now it's interesting, you know, we have this 7-year backlog for gas turbines for generation. And a lot of people are saying, the reason for that backlog is not only utility orders, but now data center orders. So we have utilities competing with data centers for the same, you know, resources. So it's already happening. So how it will impact things like community choice and microgrids, you know, I just don't know. I think, you know, I think deployments of microgrids are just a no-brainer. It's going to happen. It's already happening. But data centers are just their energy consumption is so large, you know, you really, data centers can't, you know, would just overwhelm any kind of a microgrid architecture.
I'd be a lot more comfortable if he talked about SMRs and agreed to have the waste and the decommissioning nuclear material COD his home in Seattle somewhere, right?
Right. Well, it's, you know, every week you hear another reference to data centers and SMRs. So just raising that issue.
Think about the long term. Where does that 100,000 years to protect the waste? Where does that go?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Any other questions? Oh,
I don't see any other hands up, but do you have any last thoughts, John, you want to share?
well, just, you know, I would ask that we really keep the consumer in mind as this issue becomes more prevalent in Colorado. Let's not let what happened to Northern Virginia happen here. And you can go read the horror stories. And I will point out, there's a great person on LinkedIn, Julie Bolthouse, Bolthouse. And she is with the Piedmont Environmental Center in Northern Virginia. And she posts really great information about data centers and what's going on in Northern Virginia. So I would check out her posts on LinkedIn, because I find she's probably the best person in the country as far as keeping me, you know, aware of what's going on.
Well, John, I want to thank you. I know you've come here to speak to the board a couple of times now, and that doesn't mean we won't ask you to come back again. So you always jump in and provide some great information and some very important thoughts. So thank you so much.
No problem. And just one more request, watch
Sure.
AI, watch the AI landscape and guard the consumer interests, because I really hope that they bring this AI session back and we get some good legislation. So I know the UCA will play a big role in that.
Well, if I could take a look at it. Thank you, John.
Okay. Thanks,
Terrific.
everyone.
So, folks, next on the agenda is for our Deputy Director Joe Pereira to speak to you about the Public Service Wildfire Mitigation Plan case. But before we do that, I just want to bring up something that came up. I was talking with Sandra Young earlier, and it does kind of relate to this mitigation plan, which is the potential liability of public service in the Marshall Fire multitude of lawsuits, and what that would mean if they were found liable. Where would the cost of paying for the damages for that liability end up going? And so I thought I'd call on our most senior attorney, Tom Dixon, is on to answer that for us. Tom?
Yeah, the bottom line is, assuming that there was liability determined, it would be up to the Public Utilities Commission. They would have to bring a rate case to ask for recovery or some other proceeding to seek recovery of any liability that they incurred. And this type of stuff happened in California. There were settlements where ratepayers did in the end have some responsibility for liability. So it would be up to the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. Interestingly enough, in any cost recovery, the utility is obliged to demonstrate that what they did was prudent. One might argue that if they're found to be negligent in how the Marshall Fire was started and they were responsible for it, that would suggest they were not prudent. But again, it would be a factual determination by the Public Utilities Commission as to whether they would allow any recovery against ratepayers or potentially assign all of that cost to shareholders.
Thanks, Ron. I'm sorry. Thanks, Tom. I appreciate it.
And there's a number of attorneys on, so if anyone else thinks I've missed something, feel free to jump in. But it's my perception that's what would be the case. And obviously, it would be a case of first impression in Colorado. And I should point out, one of the things that's coming down the road is the possibility of creating wildfire mitigation funds in the future. There would be a fund available to utilities to compensate for wildfire issues. Those likely would still be funded by ratepayers if they did have a future funding mechanism to address wildfires. But again, that's speculation at this point, because we don't have such a fund in this state.
And just to close the loop on the lawsuits, are we talking many years from now that those will be resolved?
The lawsuits set to go to trial, I think, in September of this year. There's about 100 cases. So it's going to take several years, I think, even after that, to figure out what's gone on and what the liability is. And then once that's determined in a final decision, again, then the utility's in the position of what are they going to do next, assuming they've been found to be partially or fully responsible for the liability and determined to be negligent. Or worse, yes, reckless. I mean, again, depends on what level of proof is provided to determine what their culpability would be.
Well, thanks, Tom, for jumping in spontaneously to help Sandra and I think this through. So related to that, in a way, is the Public Service Wildfire Mitigation Plan, which is pending at the PUC. And Joe Pereira is going to jump in here and tell us about that.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Joe Pereira. I'm Deputy Director at the UCA. Just going to take a quick minute here to update you all on where we are with the Public Service Wildfire Mitigation Plan proceeding. Leslie and Scott presented the basics on this case, I think a couple months ago, but just quickly I'll hit on high level what is happening here. Public Service, or Excel, filed a plan a few months ago requesting approval of their wildfire mitigation plan. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.6 to $1.8 billion for the next 3 years. to do a lot of things. The usual kind of wildfire mitigation activities like vegetation management and pole replacement, but then they've also requested, lots of new installation of lots of new technology to detect and prevent ignition events. And then they also have asked for approval of the process for public safety power shutoffs, or PSPS is the acronym that's often used. And so they've discussed, new control centers and coordination with local emergency managers, and kind of a whole communications process related to that. And so this proceeding has been in process. Parties have submitted answer testimony and cross answer and rebuttal from the company, and the proceeding will go to hearing this week. The big news in this proceeding is that the parties in the case have reached settlement, and it's unanimous and comprehensive from all parties involved in the proceeding. And so what the commission will be doing this week is reviewing that settlement, cross-examining or asking questions of different witnesses, and deciding if they want to approve or reject the settlement or provide modifications to the settlement. To give you an overview a bit of the settlement itself, I'll lay out, I think there are 4 kind of major levers that this settlement takes on, but there's a lot of issues in the proceeding. And so I'll talk about kind of the 4 high level or big issues. Can answer questions if folks have questions on that. Basically, as I mentioned, public service proposed. Sorry, I was reading the chat there. Public service proposed, approximately $1.6 billion in capital investments in this plan. And so the settlement approves or supports public services ask for these capital investments. What's different about this settlement, or novel about the settlement, and kind of what has led to all parties agreeing, is that the parties have agreed, and public service have agreed, for different cost recovery treatment on these assets. And so on a high level, when a utility proposes capital spending, they propose it, they build it, it rolls into rate base, and then the company earns, profit or earnings on that rate base. In this proceeding, the company has agreed and parties argued, and this was a major pillar of our advocacy within the proceeding, to securitize all of these assets. And so what that means is in 4 years, 3 or 4 years, the company will, build and put into place these assets, and then they will go and make a filing before the commission and propose that all of these assets be kind of rolled together into a bond-like mechanism and removed from rate base, or actually never hit rate base. And so I see Ron's hand up. Do you want to hop in here, Ron? Okay, I'll keep going.
Go ahead. And I'll make my comments at the end.
Okay. So the advantage from a consumer standpoint is that the bond rate generally is lower than the earnings rate from the utilities. So for example, the weighted average cost of capital for a utility is somewhere in the 7% range right now, depending on which utility we have in the state. The bond rating that was projected in this proceeding was 4%. And so there's a 3% reduction in earnings on roughly a 3% reduction in earnings on this rate base and these capital assets. And so roughly what that might translate to is something like $400 million in additional costs relative to these assets. There are other pillars that we hit on. There's some discussion about, in the meantime, in the next 3 years, how will the company collect the costs relative to the installation of capital assets that they're doing. So the parties reached settlement on that. There was an outstanding issue on what's called excess wildfire liability insurance. The issue here is, just like average residential homeowners, insurance rates are going up. For the utility around wildfire management, the excess liability insurance premiums have skyrocketed. And so parties have agreed on a deferral for 1 year or until the next rate case from Public Service on treatment of this excess liability insurance. We're currently operating under a 1-year deferral of that same insurance as well. And then the last pillar I'll hit on is there was agreement amongst the parties on the commitments that Public Service has to make around PSPS. This has a lot to do with, and was driven by Boulder specifically, around communications of customers, communications of local governments, communications of wildfire first responders. There is also discussions around coordination of activities amongst these parties, and there's quite a list, but really trying to prevent the disaster we had from a customer standpoint around Public Service's first PSPS event, a year ago or so. And so, what I could say broadly about the settlement is, it's pretty involved, pretty in-depth, and oftentimes contentious negotiation to meet settlement here. The interests that really needed to be weighed are, the risks to communities and the company around wildfire, and specifically what that means for customers. And then, this desire to always invest in new capital from the company versus, what's the best way to do cost recovery. And so I think that the settlement generally balances those interests to say, the parties involved know that we are subject to increased wildfire risk for a variety of reasons. And so lots of investments need to be made to reduce that risk. But at the same time, customers are facing tens of billions of dollars in new costs related to the energy transition, related to new transmission and distribution investments, and then these wildfire investments kind of pile on top. And so we think that the settlement reaches a tenuous balance on this, and hopefully we'll get the company up to where it needs to be in the next few years, so customers are protected and we have a generally good handle on where we go. So that's my summary. I'm happy to answer any questions. Ron had his hand up first, and then I'll go to Mike.
Yeah, a couple comments. A couple of years ago, the sage of Omaha, Warren Buffett, noted in his annual letter to his investors at Berkshire that the assignment of liability by the Oregon PUC to Pacific Corp for wildfire liability suggested to him that the salad days of investing in electric utilities were over, and that if they were going to be assigned these wildfire risks, particularly in the West, public finance needed to be engaged. And of course, I immediately thought of securitization, the tool I introduced to Chris Hansen for shutting down coal plants at a savings to customers. And Joe, I think you said that the $400 million difference between public finance, which is securitized bond rating, and the utilities was a $400 million cost. It's actually a $400 million savings. I think you just missed that one, but
yeah, I might have misspoke.
Yeah.
Sorry, definitely a savings.
Yeah.
We're not going to sign on to $400 million more costs.
Around here, we want the savings part. So public finance, I think, has a big role. You know, as the weather gets weirder and the West aridifies, we're going to see more and more wildfires, followed by debris flows and floods and all kinds of things that we haven't anticipated. And they're going to affect the big infrastructure industries. I know this from personal experience, having worked at the water board in the 90s when we had the Buffalo Creek fire. Big impact, and nobody expected that. So we need to extend our thinking. And part of this settlement, I would urge everyone to think about, would be, how do you prevent the worst of this? And there are ways to do that. You thin the forested areas, and you range goats on the rangeland. Join Parks Barrasso and not passing up the goat cheese on the cheese aisle at the supermarket. We want big herds of goats out on the rangeland, getting rid of the excess that's going to provide a fire situation like Louisville if we don't do it. So prevention has to be part of our thinking here. We can prevent some of the worst of this. We're not going to prevent all of it, but we can lessen the impacts and prevent if we think through how to mitigate. And the answer to mitigation isn't to come along afterwards, after the disaster has happened, and mitigate it. Part of the answer is in advance of the disaster, try to mitigate its worst impacts, and then we don't have to pay so much, right? So I think people's experience doesn't lead them to the right answer if all we're doing is looking at the back end and not penetrating our thinking into the front end of these disaster situations. They're coming. We know they're coming. What can we do to reduce the worst of the impacts so that we don't have to pay so much to recover from them? So
yeah,
I think thank you for listening.
Yeah, I think a lot of that similar thinking like went into our advocacy and our discussion about settling. I mean, I think we have to admit, there are two things going on in these plans at the same time. One is investments to stop fire. And I think that's generally like where we fall on where investments should be made. And then there's another pool of investments that are, what covers the utilities butt. And, those are less favorable, I think, because it's our position that these are investments the company should be doing. These are preventions that the company should be working into their business model. But in a settlement, right, you have to kind of weigh, like, what are your interests around these specific investments and what are, other parties' interests? And I think we found a good balance. I'll say one other thing on securitization that I didn't mention is what is novel about this securitization approach is generally securitization is an after event approach. So a hurricane blasts across Florida and takes down tons of infrastructure. The company needs to rebuild. They generally do that work and then securitize those investments afterwards because the rate shock from those would be so great. The novel approach here is we think we're one of the first, if not the first states to kind of take a forward-looking approach and saying we're going to do these investments, now before we see more fires, and agree on the front end securitize those as a preventative rate shock. So it's kind of like forward looking as opposed to reactionary.
Yeah, if I could just make two comments in reaction to that. One is, this suggests to me an uncharted piece of our work here going forward. You know, we plan for the resource future. We plan for the future of the distribution system. We're planning for a transmission future over at CETA, but we don't plan the financing. We don't ask the question, what's the least cost financing for our plan? And if we did that, we'd be engaging a lot more public finance in the mix and reducing the obscenely high authorized rates of return that we see around the country for utilities. The other suggestion I have for you is, it's not the electric utility's responsibility to prevent catastrophic wildfires. It's partly it's for their equipment and their operations. It is their responsibility, but it's a much bigger societal issue for us because we've got 100 years of suppression of wildfires in the forested areas, and we've got all this nice open space, rangeland kind of environment that we've created around ourselves because we like to live in a park, but it's overloaded because we don't have enough goats working on it. But we have these issues, and they're society-wide issues. So it's not the electric utility's responsibility to solve those, but it is their responsibility to be a contributor to those larger solutions. The water board couldn't solve it. The water board's now engaged with the Forest Service in thinning projects. Why? Because it protects the watershed. Is the electric utility engaged in thinning projects that help it maintain its routes through forested areas and prevent rangeland fires from emerging into Louisville? I don't think they're engaged enough. We need a societal-wide effort, and we don't have it yet. So again, end of rant, but it's just based on hairy experience I personally had with the Buffalo Creek fire serving on the water board.
Ron, I'm going to ask for your advice on the depreciation schedule of a goat when we get there.
It's totally expensed. It just takes it in one end and puts it out the other end. All good, right? And
Fair enough.
And the cheese that Parks like, just a
Mike.
Thanks, Joe, for that excellent recap of the settlement. Look, I'm just curious. We have found ourselves, we've wandered into very different territory now in all of the decision-making criteria that we need to make. What I mean by that is, up until very recently, we've had a very simple set of structures that have enabled us to make reasonable decisions about the cost to invest in utilities, very reasonable estimates and projections about what might happen. But in the recent past, we've sort of wandered into this different territory where it's now very complicated to make to use the old methods, the old models that we've been using for 25, 30 years to look at rate making activity and how we would look at capital expenditure and how we would recover or allow utilities to recover for that. Just one point of this is in reference to the fires that have hit Boulder or Boulder County recently. There was a Sugarloaf fire up behind me. I'm in central Boulder. Sugarloaf fire up behind me, and then we had the Coal Creek or the Louisville fire. And I'm just curious in this settlement, like what are the roles, or what is the role of insurance companies in these settlements? Are they advocating that public service or Excel should be paying for the settlement? The reason why I ask that question is there's a large amount of Boulder County that is now denied insurance from wildfires by insurance companies. And many consumers in Boulder County finding themselves with no insurance, which seems to push the cost again to the consumer. So I'm just really curious about the role of insurance companies in this settlement And I'm also curious about what the risk to the community is going to be for addition in the future for wildfire mitigation. That's my first sort of part of the question.
Sure.
Leave that. I have a subsequent part, but I'll just hold it there.
Sure. I don't know that I have, kind of like a specific answer on either of those. The insurance companies were not a party broadly in the proceeding, but as I mentioned, this issue of excess liability insurance was a live issue in the proceeding. And so this is the insurance that the utility is asking for, right? They're also similar, I think, to the individual customer. They're feeling pressure from insurance companies, which means ultimately that ratepayers are feeling pressure from utilities or from insurance companies, because those costs get passed on to customers. This isn't a cost for the utility, itself. It's essentially a pass through. And so like I mentioned, we've seen, this liability insurance in, since the Marshall Fire, grow 5x for the utility. There's some thought that, or there's some hope that when a utility develops an extensive wildfire mitigation plan, that then that kind of puts downward pressure on those liability insurance costs, right? You have a plan, you're less risky, but that's yet to be seen. I don't know that I've heard from our analysts that are working on the proceeding that they've even seen a real rhyme or reason as to why wildfire insurance goes up or down. It just goes up. And so we're hoping that a settlement like this, puts pressure back down on that wildfire insurance. Tom mentioned, and Leslie from our team wrote in her testimony that, ultimately some sort of, backstop fund, is probably, a better alternative to just going out to the market for insurance, in the future. Whether the state takes that on or the utility takes it on, I don't know. And then, the risk piece of it, I think the intention of the plan is to reduce risk. And as I mentioned, this is a 3-year plan. And so in 2 years, we'll see another plan from the utility, and they'll propose more spending and they'll propose more investments, with this idea in mind. To what extent it reduces risk, I don't really know.
Yeah, I did read through many of the documents that were that have been submitted on this. One of the things I thought was interesting is, I think the cost figure that I read was 1.9 billion, maybe it was 1.7, 1.9 billion. A lot of information there about how cost recovery would happen, but to the extent that I'm into the documentation, and maybe there's more of it at the Public Utility Commission level that's been filed, but quite devoid on how the costs were put together. I read through some of the cost and expenditure elements of that. I have quite a bit of experience in wildfire mitigation. I was the president of a company called eSource. I'm not sure if people know what they do. One of the things we do is help utilities with customer experience, but also do a lot of work in wildfire mitigation and this concept of risk spend efficiency, which is the way that utilities can spend their money adequately throughout the wildfire mitigation cycle, rather than starting at the beginning. Many utilities start at the beginning of their power line and they sort of go around the edges of it. That's an oversimplification. And what we were encouraging utilities to do was look at those portions of lines, the highest risk, start there and then work yourself out. But I'm just curious, and maybe this is not the right forum, in which case that's fine. But I'm just curious about the general cost side of this wildfire mitigation recovery. How are the costs being looked at? Is there an independent group that looks at the costs? Is it just the public utility commissioners and us that look through the costs to determine whether they're effective and reasonable or not? I just don't know.
Yeah, in the settlement, there's a process for reviewing a prudence review on expenditures, and the settlement lays out that only prudent costs will be included in the securitization package. And so there will be process there. I have to admit to you that our office has found the prudence review process at the PUC challenging. And so I'll add that caveat to it. I think there will be a process, and we will look through it, but the burden to show imprudent expenditures is very difficult in our experience. But we may reach out for some ideas when that comes up.
I just looked at, there was a line item 3.112 million that Phil Singer Associates were doing on one of the expense parameters for wildfire mitigation. And those guys are great, don't get me wrong, but I don't know that they're experts in wildfire mitigation. So that it seemed like, maybe going to wildfire mitigation experts might be a better choice of action rather than going to look, Phil Singer are great. I know those guys very well. I've worked with them for 25 plus years, or since Todd started it, which wasn't 25 years ago, but it's getting that way. It just seems like there's probably some different ways of looking at this stuff. But anyway, not trying to
Sure.
the agenda a different direction.
Thanks, Mike. Jessica.
I have two questions.
Sure.
First question is, what is this insurance coverage for that we're discussing here? And what other insurance does public service hold?
Sure, I could say broadly, like I said, it's excess liability insurance, specifically for wildfire. I might ask Leslie or Scott if they're on, if they want to speak to those more specifically.
I can.
Great.
Here. Jessica, so the company holds different levels of insurance during the proceeding that's associated exclusively with the excess liability insurance. They presented how they structure their multiple insurance levels. The first one being just general liability, which covers not just Excel Electric, but a portion is also allocated to Excel Gas. So they acquire, like, let's say, a general policy, and they allocate a certain amount to each one of these companies. And this is after, I'm sorry, I skipped a step. The first step is what they allocate to each one of the states where they operate, and that's their general coverage. Then after that, each state gets allocated, if they have gas and electric, like in Colorado, a percentage of each policy to each one of those services. After that comes the excess liability, which would cover anything that is not included or was not sufficient to be covered through the general liability insurance. And so what we're proposing to do is these excess liability policies are going up all over the country, and it's causing issues such as Mike mentioned before, that some insurance companies are not insuring regular residential customers and homeowners. So that is derived from two issues. One of them being the general approach that the company took towards analyzing risk zones within their proposal, which are very wide. They lacked a little bit of granularity to determine the actual highest risk zones and to make investments that way, which is why through the settlement, as Joe mentioned before, one of the other issues that were agreed that was that the company will provide a more granular assessment to try to maybe in that way send an additional signal to insurance companies saying, well, this is the actual areas that are the highest risk, and this is the measures that we are applying specifically in those areas. That was losing insurance for homeowners was one of the main concerns that we try to address during our testimony, and we provided information as far as that and requested that the company and the commission keep that in mind when analyzing the level of granularity of the studies that they provide when it comes to risk analysis. Going back to the issue of the insurance liability, the excess liability insurance, the commission approved with certain safeguards to approve the increase that was requested by the company for that excess liability insurance. We are yet to determine, and we are yet to get a signal, a correct or reliable signal that these costs for insurance will go down based on the new wildfire mitigation plan that is approved. That is something that the company couldn't answer if it was going to be able to achieve if the wildfire mitigation plan was approved. In other states, we haven't seen that either. What we have seen is a consideration for these additional funds. And these funds, or the type of fund that we are proposing to the commission and was agreed to be considered through the settlement, is a fund in which not only is the funds are not just provided by ratepayers, but are also funded through shareholder percentages allocated to this. So the whole responsibility does not fall again on top of all of our other levels of insurance that is recovered through ratepayers. Again, only on.
Yeah, thanks for laying that out. That was really helpful. And you need to mirror back to make sure that I'm understanding. So the company holds general liability, which typically has an exception clause, right? Like acts of God, like insurance isn't going to cover. So excess liability will now cover certain portions of these, well, specifically under wildfire. And it would cover basically these wildfire that the company would not have any liability, or I shouldn't use the word liability, at fault for. Is that okay?
Well, that's what has to be determined first in the general liability assessment, whether the company was at fault or not. And then if the company is found at fault, then their liability and their excess liability would immediately kick in.
I see. Oh, would apply or would not? Would apply. Okay. So it's specific for when they are at fault, the excess liability.
It's for when they are found at fault. Yes.
Right. Yeah. Yes.
So let's remember that this isn't only the liability insurance isn't only for wildfires. It's also for explosions or.
Okay, so the coverage will be for acts of God, basically, and other. Okay. Yeah. What I'm thinking through here too is like, so when we talk about consumers not having access to insurance anymore, does any of these increased insurance coverage by the company increase insurability for consumers on their private side? Don't know the answer, just curious about that. Yeah.
I do not know the exact answer, but what I can say is that certain areas that were identified by the company as risk zone 1 were areas where we had heard or read on the news or had information about that some insurance companies were not providing coverage for homeowners.
Right. Oh, Mike, yeah.
I was just going to ask a follow-on to that one, Leslie. Is there a summary of the insurance companies specifically for the Marshall Fire in either not continuing coverage? Is there a summary of the insurance for how they're going to continue I'm trying to get the right question here. Are there any summary documents that show how many insurance companies have dropped coverage in Louisville or Marshall Fire?
Not that I can reliably point you to or that I'm aware.
Okay.
Okay. So I guess I want to move on to my second question, but yeah, the reaction there would be, right. So if public service investment in the insurance for the excess liability decreases the ultimate cost to all consumers, then like, great, right? If it was gonna, assuming if something's gonna happen anyways, and if they were found at fault, right? But there is a presumption of if they are found at fault that however that excess liability insurance would be covered, whether through a bond mechanism or other, that the consumers would have a role to play. So I'm a bit curious about that. I wonder if I'm taking away the right thought here.
I mean, I think this goes back to what Tom Dixon said, before I hopped on, which is, there's a mechanism where the utility has to come back to the commission to ask for cost recovery on, everything, anything, right? And so that could be, this wildfire insurance, that could be, liability around the Marshall Fire, or it could be something, some new event in the future. One of the, and we don't know what that looks like until they, bring it forward. I think one, if we look at other states, the Camp Fire as an example in California, a lot happens outside the commission process, and then the commission is faced, with whatever the utility brings forward. So in the Camp Fire case, insurance companies, PG&E, different homeowner groups, all of these interested parties reached a settlement around liability outside of the commission process broadly. And then PG&E brought forward, I think it was $10 or $12 billion package that went for, payouts for homeowner loss, went to compensate insurance companies and all of this. And then the commission was faced with essentially approving or not approving cost recovery for that settlement. And it creates a strange dynamic, right, where the PUC is responsible for saying, hey, we'll add these into rates, but they don't have any role in kind of picking and choosing what goes into rates, right? The commission has set, or the company has put forward a plan. And so until we see, what that looks like, we don't really know, the ins and outs of the process. And this will also be the first time for us if we see one related to the Marshall Fire. And so we're going to really have to, I think it's case specific, but our experience tells us the company will come for cost recovery for anything. And our argument will be, if it's risk and if it's liability or, something worse from your end, shouldn't shareholders cover those costs, which I think is what you were maybe insinuating, that it doesn't seem fair that ratepayers pay for events that were caused by the utility's negligence or whatnot.
I'd like to ask my second question, but Terry, you raise your hand, so if it's related to the insurance piece, we could go.
Yeah, and Joe, I just wanted to toss in basically what your last point was there, that frankly, if they are found to be at fault, to what degree is it appropriate public policy to allow the consumers to pick that up, or should that 100% be a cost of the shareholders? And I'm just trying to raise that as a potential argument, and that is, frankly, I totally understand you, as part of the problem of a settlement. If a settlement is to occur, there may not necessarily be an explicit finding of fault or degree of fault or anything like that. But I would certainly hope that we are going to be making an argument, literally like you were talking about, that if there is any kind of finding of fault, negligent or otherwise, that should be accessible against the shareholders and not the ratepayers.
Yeah, I think we would make that argument. I get, go back to the Camp Fire, where they were not only, liable or negligent, but they were criminally negligent, and those costs still came into rates in California.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and I know that in the long run that ultimately impacts the utilities' ability to provide service. But hey, that's the business world. They're the ones that want to be in a monopoly, and there is such a thing as a total responsibility of the corporation itself, not ratepayers. So, thank you for that.
The other question I had is around performance measurements or metrics that are held within from this case. So, or not case, but the wildfire filing. So we don't have to go through all of them, of course, but just curious, kind of on a big picture view, how do you see, you know, what you're about, what's settled and how it measures? Is it similar in philosophy to other filings before? Is it how is it different? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I'm trying to think through how to answer that. I mean, this is the first of its kind in kind of size and scope. You know, one of the issues we raised, and then I'll pick this to Leslie to kind of maybe talk more specifics, but one of the issues that we raised from the onset was, you know, the company struggles with operational implementation broadly. Like, you know, we often see them over budget, you know, past the deadline. And so we raised that issue early on to say, you know, it's important that you know, stick to the timeline on this. And also the securitization is set up in a way as to, like, if you don't complete these, we can't really put them into the package. And so, you know, timing is important. And so I think that's a broad theme. Leslie, do you want to hit on kind of more specific performance pieces?
I think that it's important to say in this case that, as Scott and I both pointed out in our testimony, something that was lacking from the company's direct case was a very profound analysis for risk reduction or metrics of risk reduction per activity. This is the second wildfire mitigation plan, and in comparison, the previous one had a little bit more analysis of the risk decrease that the company was expecting to see per measure. However, this was not exactly the case here, and that was one of the main issues that we argued. And a lot of the measures that the company was proposing as part of the wildfire mitigation plan are activities that the company should be doing under their regular day-to-day activities. So we did point that out, and the fact that we didn't have a very extensive analysis of the benefits per activity, and it's hard to point out sometimes why the overall risk reduction based on the fact of that a lot of these causes of wildfires from the utilities perspective or caused by a utility are not necessarily always within their control. A lot of these wildfires can be caused either by issues of climate change or birds or winds. So the only thing that we have to go by is if the company complied with schedule, operation, and maintenance activities, including vegetation management, which is the highest level of wildfire reduction, risk reduction comes from activities such as vegetation management. The other activity that tests very high in these metrics is undergrounding, but the company indicated through the process that they had no real experience undergrounding at the extent of what they wanted to underground here, or in particularly in those areas where they're planning to, in general, do undergrounding. So what was agreed was a portion of that would be in areas such as Boulder that has had already wildfires. So the metrics not necessarily were at all satisfactory, but what we have to go by is experience in comparison from those activities in other states. And for example, another thing that
Leslie,
was supported
Leslie,
was technology-based activities, as the
Leslie,
video cameras and AI. Those are very effective at detecting wildfires or smaller fires before they get out of control. Yet it's hard to assign to those activities a level percentage of risk reduction.
so Leslie, thank you for all this information. I'm going to have to cut off the discussion because we have another important agenda item. But what I want to say is, I'm just thrilled to hear all this given back and forth with our staff and members, and just there's so much involved in this type of issues new to the country, and also so much money involved. So thanks everybody. I'm going to toss the microphone, so to speak, to folks from our team at DORA, which is the Department of Regulatory Agencies, in which our office is housed as a division. And with us is Bindu Miriala, who is our coordinator of all the DORA boards and commissions, of which I think there are 40. And you guys are one. That's an important one, most important one. And then we also have with us Ginny Brown, who's the deputy executive director of DORA. So I'm going to toss it to you, Bindu.
Okay, Ginny, you want to go first or shall I go with the presentation?
Okay.
Sure, I'll just go for, first I want to say thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in everybody in the board meeting today. The conversation has been fascinating. And for somebody who's really an implementation geek and on the administrative side of what the department does, I don't really get the opportunity to listen to everybody, but the conversation is fascinating. And as Cindy mentioned, Bindu and I are going to we're going to walk you through the onboarding process of as you are welcomed onto the board, and we're going to kind of get into some nitty gritty with regards to the email, cybersecurity, and those kinds of things. And when you were onboarded with the attorney, there was an affidavit that you would have signed just acknowledging that you understand a lot of these things. It also relates to legislative activity, media communications activity, and all sorts of things like that. So Bindu's going to walk through the presentation, and she's going to also get to the point to where when we do have the conversation about the state board email, I do want to recognize first and foremost that anything that you experience related to your process for how you're onboarding, please let Cindy know if there's things that we can and should be doing better, because we have, as Cindy mentioned, actually it's 44 boards, and it's close to 400 board and commission members across the agency, and they come from all over. We have different kind of boards, and the appointments, there are governor appointments, legislative appointments, but fundamentally, regardless of who appoints you, DORA is, as the principal department, we are the one that's responsible for how your board is conducted, making sure it adheres to all laws, procedures, and those kinds of things. And we can also get into more detail on some of those different items. But one of the things I did want to mention that in particular to the email address, there's a couple of things that's really important about that. One is that it provides security with regards to when we're exchanging state information with you, as opposed to if you have a personal email or your state work email. Given the state, we prefer our cybersecurity and our firewalls, and with OIT have agreed that that's really the safest way for us to communicate with you via an email. Keeps that information safe. The other aspect is, and not many people think about this, but when we have an open records request, which we do get frequently, but in the event, anybody from the public can request information from anything related to what DORA does. And how that would work, and generally how it works, is that we would need to search documents that everybody has access to and emails. And the last thing we really want to do is search through your personal or work email, which is the other reason why we do give the state email address to everybody. So happy to talk about that further, but I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Bindu, and then she can kind of walk through the cybersecurity part with you. And I do have to say that in comparison to the conversation that you all just had, this is probably the least sexy part of what you're going to do when you're on this board. And I recognize that. I own that. But with that, it's just kind of, we're just here to keep information safe. So Bindu, I'll take it to you. Or
Okay,
hand it
I'm
to you.
sharing my screen. Thank you, Ginny. Okay, hope everyone are seeing my screen. Hi, I'm Bindu Miriala. I'm Boards and Commissions Coordinator. You may have seen so many emails from me, especially on the cybersecurity trainings. Yeah, as Ginny mentioned, we talked with the cybersecurity OIT team, and then they said this year they have so many changes, like as they wanted to articulate these courses every month, not like only sending 6 courses at one time, not like that. Every month, they are going to give you 12 cybersecurity courses, and then all DORA boards and commission members, they will receive each month assigned like as in the first 7 days of the month. And then this each course will cover a key cybersecurity topic, and it include a short assessment. It won't take much time, like as 3 to 6 minutes of time it will take. And then the training is designed to enhance cybersecurity awareness and compliance with the state policies. So and we wanted to let you know there is one more course, that is acceptable use policy acknowledgement, will be also given to you other than these 12 courses. But I promise you, these are all very simple questions they will ask after the assessment, like as two to three questions, and it will be very easy. And we as a state employees also, we receive the same kind of courses. And I always love to see what are the new things in the cybersecurities and how we have to protect our systems from from threats, all those kind of new technology I want to see from the cybersecurity team. That will be some exciting part, I feel. Sorry, but this is a mandatory courses we have to do. Any questions on this slide 2 so far? Okay then. So the next part is the login and access is the main. We see so many issues when you are trying login. Um, so there is a document on this one I can show on my screen. So I have sent a couple of times this how to log in and what are the login issues you may face. And there are two types of logins here. If you have login information from last year, you can go to this page directly and you can plug in your login information, and then you can directly go into the SOC Learns, for example, and you can see what are the courses you have been assigned for this year. And then no, you don't have any login information. You are a new member, so you need to go to the self-registration page here, and they will ask a couple of questions, your email ID and division, DORA, you have to select here, and so and so. If you fill all this information, you are going to create a new account into the SOC Cybersecurity Learns website. So then after 24 hours or 1 day or 2 days, you will receive courses here, and then you can go and check on your account. All the courses will be there, and you can do the courses, complete the courses as every month you receive those courses. So I have given the document here as well. Hector, if you can share this presentation to your board members, that will be great. If you click here, you will get those document as well in the presentation. There is a link here. So these training assessment assignments, as I mentioned before, they will be emailed during the first 7 days of each month. So if you go to the login information, you need to log in with your state credentials to complete these assigned courses, not with your personal emails. I recommend with the state email credentials only you try to log in into these courses. And then, so if you get into any issues, like as you forgot password or something, this SOC Learns website is very easy. If you can click on the forgot password, they will send you a link, so you can reset your password immediately. This is not like as a state email. Only we have like is in state email. If you can write down your password anywhere, you can maintain the state email if you didn't forget your password. But we have some policies, so OIT for your state email, if you forget password, we need to reset through admin only. So I need to work with OIT to get you a new password for your state email address, but not for the SOC Learns. You can directly reset the password through the links, and they have provided the links in the website as well. So these are the login. Anytime if you get any issues, please contact me. I will work with OIT and I can provide you anywhere, even for the SOC Learns also. If you need password, if the password link is not working, you can send me an email. I can work through the OIT and I will send you the password, new passwords, and any kind of troubleshooting I can do that one. Sorry if I'm going fast. Please let me know any questions in this slide as well. Okay, then we are going good. Then the expectations on these cybersecurity trainings are, as I mentioned earlier, each assigned training must be completed within 30 days of the receiving the email notifications. Otherwise, OIT cybersecurity team will send you the reminder emails 1 week before the deadline of the training is incomplete, and also a final reminder for any outstanding training will be sent in the 3 days before the deadline. And also they started sending these courses for January, February, March, and also AUP. These 4 courses were assigned in the month of April. So and also the May is also there, right? So there will be 5 courses when you log in into your cybersecurity website, or when you are creating a new account. Also, you can see there will be 5 courses you have to complete. So because of 5 months, and then there will be AUP also. Totally 6 courses you can see there. So this year, as per OIT guidelines on the cybersecurity, the non-compliance actions will be there. Board or commission members who fail to complete the training may face restrictions on their access to state systems and cannot fulfill their work obligations. This is the mandatory action we are going to implement from this year, because these instructions came from OIT cybersecurity team. So these are the basic questions or knowledge I want to share on the cybersecurity, because we talked with the OIT a couple of times back and forth, and this from this year onwards, they wanted to maintain the policy, so they are very strict on this one. So any questions on these ones? Okay.
Bintu, I'll just mention that these meetings are recorded, and the recording's on our website, but also I'm going to ask Hector to send the link to everybody in addition, so that, there's a lot of information, but they can review it in their own times.
Yeah, Hector, you can also share the presentation if they that may be helpful with them, all the board members. Okay, thanks everyone. Yeah.
I'm going to ask Jenny to jump back in, if you could.
Yeah, thanks, Cindy. There's one other thing I forgot to mention earlier that the department does, and that is the sunset and sunrise process through the Colorado Office of Policy Research and Regulatory Reform. And I'm going to put this link in the chat. And the reason why I'm mentioning it is because, oops, put the wrong link in there. Is because that the Public Utilities Commission is currently under review for sunset. And what that means is that we, the folks that are in the Office of Policy Research and Regulatory Reform, they evaluate different aspects of the Public Utilities Commission based upon 14 different criteria. And we are interviewing folks. We are going out and having one-on-one interviews. We're also getting written comments, and that's the link that I had sent Cindy. So that'll link you to all the sunsets that we have, but as you just scroll right through it, you'll find just a box for PUC. And so the idea is to provide feedback with regards to how the PUC functions, what you think can and should be done differently. And just be as comprehensive as possible. And there are opportunities where after we get written comment, we will ask folks to do a one-on-one interview. And if you're interested in that, we're happy to do that. So that then results in a bill for the legislative session for the 2026 General Assembly. Some of you may have remembered one from, I think it was 2019. We had a short sunset date on this one where it's coming up now in 2025. So we're gathering all that information. Happy to answer any questions about that too.
I have a couple just real quick. So if somebody submits comments or they, speak one-on-one, is that treated as confidential that they said that stuff?
It is, yes, in the beginning, but after the sunset is published, the notes are open to Cora. Yeah. So I think ideally just make sure that, I guess, maybe provide your comments, but if you don't want it on the 5 o'clock news, then I probably wouldn't say it. Although I did talk to Texas, who has a very robust process, and they said that they get quite a lot of frankness from the people that provide written comments, and they actually post those comments. So, I mean, if you're okay with what you said, then own it, and yeah. But
if it has to be said, then you just say it.
Might as well. This is the time to do it.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, listen, thank you guys for hanging in there with us, going long today. But it was at least a couple of really issues for robust discussion. So appreciate your sitting in with us. And
it was fascinating. Thank you all for what you do. That was just really fascinating. So
great. So I would just emphasize with folks that if you get an email from Hector or myself or Bill Still, the chair, answer it. Your response is sort of part of your obligations and as a member, and we won't bother you. We won't bug you. Thank you, Jenny and Binda. I think maybe it's 12 o'clock straight up. So if I don't see any hands, I think it's time for us to adjourn. We don't meet in June. We meet every other month from now until the beginning of the year because of we meet once every month during the legislative session, and then once every other month starting now. So we will see you in July, but I, myself, Hector, we're all available if you want to talk or have questions. So anyhow, thank you all for sticking in there with us and for participating. Appreciate it. Okay, have a good day. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.